Parth as welcome. Wonderful to see you. You're looking as fresh and young. And I keep saying that Shakti Sinha is increasingly looking like the Southeast Asian Buddha as days pass by.
No Buddha.
Laughing Buddha.
Sundaramji, vanakkam.
Vanakkam, vanakkam.
So, if with all your, with your permission, Vishnuji, Shakti since we can start.
Please, we are ready to hear. Please.
Others could mute themselves, so that will be very disturbing.
I want to actually start with a vote of thanks. I want to really thank Dr. Parth Shah, not only because he's a very dear friend, a very dear elder friend, and someone from whom many of us have learned a lot regarding public policy. And there's a particular line of thinking, a particular point of view, a certain legacy that Dr. Parth Shah has kept alive through his work, through his argumentations, articulations, and narrative. And I've also been very fond of that legacy, and that is the Swatantra, the conservative, the Swatantra Party legacy in that sense, which brought together some of the best minds post-independence in the country. And I can but today make this observation when I start that Pandit Deendayal Upadhyay and that entire generation worked very closely. On the one hand, Rajaji, on the one hand, K. M. Munshi, and that entire generation worked very closely to articulate a new vision of India. And it was a very interesting, a very enlivening, a very thought-provoking vision and narrative that they always put forward. Dr. Parth Shah is of that legacy, but in his own, through his own work, through his own heading the Center for Civil Society, one of the leading think tanks in the country, he has brought in a number of debates, issues, and narrative in the country. Main in that is education. He is the founder of the Center for Civil Society, a think tank that champions individual choice and institutional accountability. He recently co-founded Indian School of Public Policy that offers 1-year full-time postgraduate program in policy design and management. His research and advocacy work focuses on the theme of economic freedom, law, liberty, and livelihood campaign, choice and competition in education, fund students, not schools, property rights, approach for the environment, terracotta vision of stewardship, and good governance, new public management, and the duty to publish. He spends the rest of the time on chess, cards, badminton, tennis with his 8-year-old son. But you see, what is important for us here is good governance. And that is something which really exercises us as well. So I want to welcome Dr. Parth Shah to this for this evening. I want to thank him, and I also want to welcome Shri Shakti Sinha, member of the advisory board of SPMRF, an extremely dear friend, director of Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Public Policy Research and International Studies, MS University, Vadodara. He is also director, Delhi School of Public Policy and Governance, an institution of excellence set up by the University of Delhi. Early was the director of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. Was in the IS batch of 1979 and up to 2013, having been Chief Secretary, Andaman Nicobar Administration, Principal Secretary, Finance, Delhi, Secretary, Education in Goa, Director of Education, Delhi, and worked very closely with former Prime Minister late Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. I think we have these two very fascinating minds joining us today here. And without much ado, I would like to invite Shri Parth Shah to speak on the national education policy. There's just one sentence that I want to cite from Prime Minister Modi's address on the NPE on 7th August, where he said very interesting points he made in that address of his, but where he said, we have to make our students global citizens. Simultaneously, we also have to keep in mind that they stay connected to their roots. The need for education, the need of the hour is to teach students with inquiry-based, discovery-based, discussion-based, and analysis-based ways. I think there are very interesting concepts in the national education policy, like Professor M.K. Sridhar spoke to us exactly last week in our series of outreach that we are doing. The focus on the dignity of teachers, as Prime Minister has said, and many other aspects that come up. And I think Dr. Parth Shah is an equally fascinating mind, and we look forward to listening to you at this moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ganguly and Dr. Sinha.
Voice?
Can you hear me?
No, not audible. Just okay.
No, loud and clear. I can hear Parth very clearly.
I can also hear him.
All of us are hearing him.
Yes.
You can. पार्थ जी का आवाज नहीं आ रहा है तो बोल तो आवाज नहीं.
Parth, could you speak again? I heard you
Yes.
clearly.
Yeah, yes, you are clear. Absolutely fine.
Okay.
Yeah, before Parth starts, can we request everybody to mute themselves? Otherwise, we
Yes.
get disturbing sounds on the side.
Yes. I request everybody to please keep yourselves mute because we want to listen to the lead speaker of the day and not listen to our own echoes and voices. That is for a spiritual occasion when you listen to your own echoes, not today. So please let's keep ourselves muted.
Thank you, Dr. Ganguly and Dr. Sinha, for inviting me. This is really a great opportunity to speak to a very distinguished audience of the Saurabh Mukherjee Research Foundation. I have worked on quite a few issues with Dr. Ganguly earlier. Now, maybe I can also start with a thank you note, as he did, not just for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk to you and discuss this important policy issue for our country. But also, I think mentioning Swatantra Party and the legacy of Swatantra Party that he referred to in his opening remarks. Right? And I certainly am very proud of that legacy. And a lot of work that CCS has been doing is to promote some of the foundational ideas that the party actually stood for. If you read the 21 principles of Swatantra Party that they drafted in late 60s, right, when they came on the scene, they are as relevant today, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you see it, as they were in the late 60s when they started. Right? I want to thank Dr. Sinha because when he was in charge of the Nehru Library, we got hold of Swatantra Party papers, which were actually housed by long-term secretary of Swatantra Party. He was there from the very beginning, with Rajaji and Minu Masani. And so when we got the papers, we reached out to Dr. Sinha to see whether we can house those papers at the library. And he was really very generous and forthright in accepting those papers. And I know they are in now very good hands at the library, even though he's not there, but he has passed on those papers in a good way. So I am hoping that those papers will be digitized and then be available to the scholars. I think it's an important part of our heritage and history, right? That needs to be properly documented. Not just documented, I would say, but also deep analysis and understanding that we need to do of their thinking and ideas of the time. And small ways the CCS has been part of that legacy. I'm certainly very grateful for that opportunity. Now, I think my sort of way of thinking about education policy, right, I want to sort of preface that before I sort of talk about what are the key elements I see in the policy which would drive the transformation that we are all looking for in the sector. So my view of education is that the policy should focus on the architecture of the regulatory architecture, or you can say institutional architecture of education. And many of the details in terms of what happens in a classroom, right, what kind of courses are being offered, whether there is a movement from one course to the other, from science to arts, arts to back to science, right, or other disciplines that we have. All of those details, in a sense, should be left to the other individual states, right, to some extent. And I would argue far more to the institutions themselves, right? Either the schools or colleges, which are the ones who are at the front line of this educational revolution that would happen. Right? So I think one way of thinking about this is the issue of autonomy and the authority that is granted to the local institutions, schools and colleges, right? And thinking deeply about how much of that can be given to them, right? Now, how much needs to be retained at the district, state, or the central level, right? I think that's an important part of the larger policy discussion in the space. I think it's very important for us to understand, despite the impulse to sort of, in a sense, I would say, impose one's view of what's good education, right? I think we have to fight that impulse and think about the regulatory and institutional architecture of the system and focus on that at the national level, right? And then leave as much as the details to the states and institutions themselves, right? That's how I think about the education policy overall. And therefore, my focus of what I'm going to sort of pick out from the NEP 2020 is largely on that regulatory and the institutional architecture, right, that I think is the central to the transformation of education as we see it, or as we would like to see it. And I will leave out some of the details part of it, which are also very good points made in the NEP. I would not refer to them in as much detail in my opening remarks. We can certainly come back to discuss it later on. So from the now larger institutional architecture point of view, right, what is the key reform, or what are the key reforms in the NEP? So I'll talk about 4 or 5 of those. I'll mention a few of those other ones which are also important, but I'm not focusing on them in as much detail. And I would also want to sort of pick bones in a sense on a couple of issues which are in the NEP, just to make sure that we have some point of disagreement and discussion also. So in terms of the larger architecture, I think the most foundational reform, the most transformative reform that the NEP 2020, right, is the separation of functions, or separation of roles, or separation of powers, how we want to sort of phrase that line, right? In the NEP, it talks more about separation of functions, right? And this, what it means is that, to think about it, what has been the case so far. Let's just take at the state level. There's the Department of Education at the state level. There's the Secretary of Education, who in a sense is at the epitome of the department, right? And he or she is in charge of running the whole department. Now think about what the department does. Right? So department is also a policy-making body. They obviously make policies within the framework of the larger laws that exist in the country, right? They're also regulator. They make regulations which apply to private schools, and of course, in some cases also to public schools. Right? They are also a service provider. They often run the government schools, right? And I'm focusing on schools just for the sake of simplicity. Obviously, same would apply to higher education large. Right? So they're also service provider. Right? They're also adjudicator. If there's a dispute between, say, a private school on any of the issues of policy or executive orders which are issued by the department, so it first go to the department itself for adjudication. And obviously, if that doesn't work, go to the High Court later on. So they are also adjudicated. They are also, in a sense, right, setting standards of quality. Right? They decide what are the appropriate standards of learning, right? Quality what should happen in the state education system. All of these functions are performed by one single department and supervised by one single secretary. And my submission has been, and this is my key argument for a long time to the work done at CCS, there is no human being possibly can look after all of these functions, right, in an effective manner. And if you look at just in India, we don't even have to go outside what other countries have done in education sector. If you look at just in India, the sectors that have done well, right? Telecom, finance, right? Most of those sectors, one thing which is common to all of them is the separation of roles and functions. Just take, for example, telecom. In telecom, we have a department, which is a policy-making body. Right? We have the two government, BSNL, two government companies or agencies, which are service providers, along with many other private service providers in the sector. We have TRAI, which is a regulatory authority of telecom. We have TDSAT, which is the arbitration or tribunal for arbitration, which is an independent body. So we have separated policy making, service provision, right, regulation, and adjudication of disputes function across these 5 different agencies. And one thing I would submit to you that much of what is good in our telecom sector is primarily a result of this separation of functions, right? Thereby each agency is able to specialize. TRAI, as you know, puts out a lot of white papers for discussion on important issues before they become very relevant for policy. They want to create that discussion upfront, right? Solicit people's views, understand different points of views on that issue, and then slowly come up with some regulation that would be applicable, generally acceptable to the larger group of stakeholders, right? So there's a role for specialization, right? There's a role for continuous and ongoing engagement with a single issue of regulation in telecom, right? That the TRI is able to do. It's also possible to hold them to account because we know exactly what the role is. It's not to do everything, it's to do one thing, regulate the telecom sector. They are not responsible for service provision, right? There's some other agencies are doing that. The private bodies are doing it. So I think it brings specialization, expertise, right? Accountability, all of the key things we need in an agency that would function well in the democratic system. And you see the similar thing happening in the finance and banking, right? We have said RBI, right? A lot of different agencies looking after different roles within that sector. And I think education has been, in a sense, way behind that revolution of management of the domain or function. Right? So education as a function, we look at that from the government point of view. How should government be managing that role, that function? Right? I think we have not applied the recent learnings from the world. This is not just in India, from around the world, as we have done in other sectors of the economy, and quite successfully so. But we have not taken that learning to education. And to me, the biggest, I think, the reform, right, that in my personal view would make the most critical and pivotal change in how education gets delivered is this separation of functions. Okay. Now, it is, I think, one of the most profound idea and articulated well in the document. Of course, the larger document also had the same idea in a lot more detail. And I think that is the key focus that should be driving us in terms of how to make the separation work well, right? And it requires many, many things to be done. Right? It's not going to be easy to figure out how to design these agencies, how to set rules and regulations around the agency, how to staff these agencies, how to train the people who are going to be sitting in these agencies. Right? And all of that is a very hard work, long work. Right? But I think that is the work that I think is at the foundation of what we want to achieve in the education sector. NEP lays out this separation of functions, and is this. The Department of Education would be a policy-making body, would also look up to some extent and other requirements. The Directorate of Education would become the service provider. They will be in charge of looking at government schools, hiring teachers, training them, disciplining them, right? Promoting some of them to principal level, holding them to account, right? Training principals as leaders of the school. All of those functions are going to perform by now the Directorate of Education. They are the one body responsible for the quality of education that happens in government schools. I think it's clear accountability also set that way. We know who to go to when we find problems with the government education quality. There's a separate state school standards authority, which is going to set its quality standards and the norms of affiliation or accreditation, right, for the schools. There's an independent body, the third body that look after the standards and quality standards in the system. Right? There are, of course, state boards for examination, and there's, of course, CBSE as a national board, and of course, there are other boards which are going to set up for examination. This is separate, and I think the names have changed in the various versions of the NEP. It was called in the first version National Assessment Center for School Education, which I think now is called Prakhar. A separate acronym has been given to that. But that's an agency which is going to focus on assessment, right, of learning outcomes, not board exams, which is quite different. Right? I want to make sure that we understand the distinction. Right? So the CBSE and other boards are, of course, going to perform their role, and they're also going to be redefined in terms of what would they assess and how. But we are a separate agency which will look after and specialize in assessing learning, and that's an important science of learning, which has been missing in our system for a long, long time. Right? How do we understand how students learn? Right? And it's different. We know culturally it makes a huge difference in terms of how students learn. Right? Even though they're learning maybe same alphabet or same 2 + 2, the way you teach, the way they absorb that learning is very different depending on the context in which they operate. Right? So science of learning is something that this agency would focus on, right? And thereby also develop the tools of assessment, which are the right kind of tools for us to understand not just how well we are doing in terms of the health checkup of the system, if we are doing well overall in the state or the country, but also looking at specific remedial inputs that needs to be provided to individual students. Right? You want to have assessment that guides the teacher and provides information to her what she should do differently in the classroom tomorrow. Right? And that is the science of learning assessment that we need to have. Right? And I hope that the agency plays that very critical role that it needs to perform. So I think this is how the current layout looks at the school education level. There's a slight difference at the higher education, but a very similar pattern has been followed. In higher education, I think as Dr. Panagaria has been writing and pointing out, right, we have already done quite a bit of work along these lines. In the National, the Medical Commission of India Act. Right? So we replaced Medical Council of India with the Medical Commission of India. There's a new act that has been passed, which already includes some of the separation of functions ideas in the structure. And a similar structure can be applied to other areas of higher education that we have done for medical education. And I think we already have one good blueprint in medical education about how to think about this separation of roles, the agencyfication, as it is technically called in the public management literature. You have sort of agencyfication, putting agency with a very clear mandate in charge of that role. Right? And I'm hoping that we can learn from the Medical Education Act and how that has been implemented so far, and bring some of that learning in thinking about the higher education architecture as we move forward. So to me, that's the biggest thing in my mind in the FP. Right? I'll cover a couple of other things that I would highlight. Second, I think most important, and which is where Right to Education Act, I think, went completely on a bad, wrong path. Right? which was the focus on inputs and infrastructure. Right? So RT was very focused on defining at a very minute level the requirements of inputs and infrastructure. A classroom in a school must be minimum 300 square feet. You cannot have a classroom with less than 300 square feet. A library must contain X number of books. Right? A playground must be of this size. Right? Teachers should be of this qualification, get only this kind of training. All of those input requirements were heart of the RT. And I think as we of you, of course, know by now, and a lot of discussion has happened in the last 10 years since RT was passed, that focus has not really resulted in much improvement in quality of education. Yes, we got more students in the classroom, in the schools, but what they have learned in those classrooms and schools is actually been going down, as we understand from not just Pratham survey that is done annually, but also from some of the government surveys, the national achievement surveys the government has been doing lately. So I think both from government data as well as the Pratham data, we know the quality of learning has been going down since RT has been passed. I think biggest departure the NEP makes from the RTA way of thinking is moving attention away from inputs infrastructure and focusing on learning outcomes. I think that is other substantial and most foundational transformative change in the NEP. Right? What we want to hold the system and the schools and teachers and everyone else in the system accountable is for learning outcomes. Right? Not whether they have the right kind of facilities. Of course, they need to have facilities, and they will. Right? You cannot, some cases, improve learning outcomes unless you provide those supportive structures. But that shouldn't be the primary sort of guide or a benchmark for success. Right? Yes, we need the separate toilet for girls and boys in the school. You need drinking water facility. You need all of those things. There's no denial of that. But if that is the only thing you are focusing on, then that's the only thing you are going to get. You're not going to get what you really want, which is learning outcome. Right? I understand. I was part of this debate around RT when it first started in 2004, a little bit earlier also. And I know there's a belief among the experts at the time, right, educationists at the time, that if you get all the inputs right, the outcome would happen. Right? And if you want to I want to simplify the philosophy underlying RTE. That was the philosophy, right? And it also made sense because if you think about the diversity we have in the country, right? How do I make sure that I have equitable education system in the country? How do I make sure that the school in Delhi or in Mumbai or in Indore is a similar one that is in Bolangir? And it is a right impulse. We are all concerned about that. We want to make sure that people are not treated differently. They are not in different quality of education depending on where they are, right? And one way of thinking and solving that problem of equity was to standardize infrastructure and input. Right? And that was driving RTE at the time. I think many people pointed out that the impulse is right. We need to worry about equity in the system. Right? But the way to worry about equity is not by focusing on inputs and infrastructure. Right? And I think we learned 10 years of RT experience that some of the critics have been right in highlighting why focus on learning outcome would be the right one, even for the point of view of equity. I think third thing, and this is because we also work with low-fee private schools. So I'm also secretary of an association of low-fee private schools in the country. And largely we work with them because we know the poor parents are now sending their kids to both type of schools. Right? It's no longer the case the poor are only going to government schools. Right? Many of the poor parents with the hard-earned money, and you know how hard it is for them to give those tuition fees to private schools, but many of them are sending their kids to private schools. Right? We thought concern is about the people in poverty and what education they get is to be focused not just on government schools, because that's very important, but also on this low fee or budget private schools, right, which are also serving the same largely the same clientele or the same population of the country. And therefore, I think one thing that NEP does is to provide a level playing field between government schools and the private schools, right? And largely through independent regulator, the School Standards Authority, right, would setting standards and applying those standards to both government schools as well as to private schools. Now we know that in theory, of course, government schools were also held to account under the law as much as private schools. But in practice, given the fact that the policy making as well as policy enforcement was done by the same department, in practice, the law got applied to private schools, but rarely to government schools. Right? And therefore, you hear so many stories in the last few years about private school principals and teachers being thrown in jail for some violations. But you hardly ever see that happening to a government school teacher or principal. Right? And there's a divergence in the application of the law. The one thing that our NEP does is to bring students at the center, not teachers, not schools, not principals, right? Not the administrators of education, right? But the students, and which is what should be the right focus for education policy. It's thinking about from the students' point of view, what serves their purpose, not what serves the purpose of the teachers or principals of the schools. I think the second and third biggest difference I see is in terms of the opening up of the sector to alternative education. We have talked about that a lot before RTE. And I'm sure you know a lot of work has been done in the domain in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Right? With the RTE, it became a single definition of education. The education is one that happens in a school as defined by the Act, the 300 square feet of classroom and all of those. Right? If it happens anywhere else outside that defined school, then it's not education. And that's how it was being treated. Right? And that was a guillotine on the head of many of the non-profit NGO schools. And there are hundreds and thousands of them which have closed down immediately after RTE. Right? There are schools I know which were serving only the workers of bricklanes in Maharashtra and some of the middle states, right, where migrant workers used to come there to work in bricklanes, and the kids would come with them. There was no school nearby for them to go to, and many NGOs set up schools just to serve those kids of the bricklane workers. Right? Similarly, for sugar plantations in Maharashtra and many other such areas of economy where there's a migrant population workers coming in, right? And many of them brought their kids with them. And many of the schools were serving really great cause of making sure that they get some education, right? Even though the school would be in a hut, it's not a proper building, right, which is earthquake proof. There are no toilet facilities of the kind that you expect in a proper school, right? But they did provide service to those kids to meet their basic need of education, right? All of those schools actually closed down immediately after RTE because they were not meeting the infrastructure requirements of the RTE. Right? And no NGO wanted to be working against the law. Right? I know many of the people from other countries who had funded schools in their native village, right, stopped funding it. And those schools also closed down because sitting in the US or UK or Australia or Singapore, you don't really want to take a panga with the law in India. Right? You don't know what's going to happen. Right? And those schools, since they could not meet the infrastructure requirements, also closed down. So I think that was a very big blow that RT sort of put on many of these non-profit NGO philanthropic schools in the country. So the one thing that NEP does is to strengthen the alternative modes of education. One way it does effectively, I think, and that is the right focus for NEP, is to expand the work of NIOS, the National Open School System. Right? NIOS has been, in a sense, was told by the RTE that they need to close down because you cannot have any informal education. You cannot learn somewhere else and then take the NIOS exam, and then be considered for say college admission, or go from grade 5 to 6 by taking that exam and proving that you have done up to grade 5. Right? So one great thing about NEP is the strengthening of the NIOS. Right? And there's quite a bit of sort of work which is done in that area. And NEP, I think, focuses rightly on how to strengthen NIOS, how to bring reputation, build reputation and brand for NIOS, right? Because currently people do not see much value in the NIOS certification. And there are inherent challenges there in the way currently it is being done. But there are not really something that cannot be remedied. Right? So NIOS not only going to be strengthened, and the NEP talks about creating similar bodies at the state level, so that even the local language, local dialect a student is learning in, for example, can be also be assessed, and he or she can be certified that they have learned up to this level, class 5 or class 8 or class 10 or class 12, right? And I think that's an important way to diversify and democratize education, right? The whole debate around English medium, I think, is not going to go away unless we make other options possible, right? And make them viable, make them respected, at least in the eye of the law, in the eye of the system, right? People who would come next, right? They will begin to see and give respect to it once the law and the system begins to give respect to all these different languages and dialects. I think that is a very powerful change in the right? Homeschooling, which was declared illegal by RTE, Supreme Court also ruled on that. Now it would not be illegal. I know there are very few people who do homeschooling. It's a very difficult challenge actually to do homeschooling. But I've met so many dedicated families, right, who believe in homeschooling, who believe in the values of their family and culture they want to imbibe in their own children. And I think in a democracy, they should have a right to do it. Right? Yes, we can always tell them there are other ways of achieving that goal. But if they want to do homeschooling, it should be their right to do it, as long as certain standards of learning. Again, the focus on learning outcome helps you to diversify them. Right? I'm not going to worry about whether your school is right kind of, your home is right kind of school or not, from infrastructure point of view. I'll worry about whether your child is learning what he or she should be learning at a given age. Right? And there's interesting debate around this around the world. How do you define those age-appropriate standards of learning? And how strictly do you want to enforce those standards outside the formal school system? Right? And that's happening in Germany, right? It's happening in UK. There's a lot of debates on that. And I'm sure we will learn from those debates, make informed decisions in terms of what we need to do in our country. I think those are my sort of key areas of focus in terms of what I see as the institutional architecture that will be different in the NEP, which in my view is the most fundamental change that was necessary, required, and is being done by the NEP. Right? There are many other good things, and I'm sort of skipping those over. I'm sure other speakers in the series will talk about, and have already talked about on this, the foundational literacy and numeracy focus, that by grade 3, everybody should be able to read and write, right? Is an important component of the NEP. The focus on early childhood education is now going to apply from age 3, not from age 6 anymore, as RTE was focused on. Right? There is, of course, gender inclusion fund, very important, I think, concern that we all have, and this is one good way to address that concern about gender equality in the education system. Right? There are many other things in higher education in terms of flexibility of the courses, what you can move from one course to the other. On all of those things, you can take credit from one college and go to other college later on if you want to take a break in between. Right? So all of those things are great ways to open the system up. Right? I hope that we are going to be able to implement many of those ideas effectively as we move forward. Lastly, I think I will just mention a couple of points of disagreement, or I think that needs a little deeper thinking. Maybe it's not so much disagreement, but I think it's maybe a matter of emphasis in some sense. One is the focus on the exams. So NEP says that we are going to have an exam at the grade 3, grade 5, grade 8, right? So 3 new exams are added. We already have the grade 10 and 12 exam, the board exams, which have been there earlier. But in addition to those 2 exams, we have 3 more during the first 12 years of schooling. Right? Again, I think we can all understand the impulse behind it, which is also part of the experience we had with the RTE. Right? There's no detention clause in the RTE, which required that you cannot hold the child back, that you cannot fail the child in a sense. Every child will be promoted to the next grade. Right? Of course, there are different set of ideas behind it, how that was supposed to work, but obviously it worked very differently in reality on the ground. And then governments had to come back, including many state governments, requested the union government to sort of repeal that part of the RTE. Right? And so I think the fear that government has and the experience of RTE tells us that if you don't have any exams, then everybody gets promoted. Right? And you keep promoting them year after year after year. And you find out in grade 10, when there's a board exam, external examination, that the kids have not learned much at all in the 10 years of their schooling, which is what we are learning from the Pratham survey. Right? There's very little learning that has happened, and learning levels are going down after the RT. Right? So there's a fear that if you don't have exam, and I think this is, of course, part of our cultural history in some sense, we want to put it that way, that unless there's a danda at the end, people don't focus on what they should be doing. Right? And the exam is like that danda we want to put in the system. To both, right? Not just to pressure parents and students, but they equally to put a pressure on the teachers and the schools, right? That if you don't train them proper, don't provide right education and learning, we would know, the system would know, the public would know, right? The educators would know that this many students are failing in schools in grade 3, grade 5, grade 8. And that could become then a way of doing things differently with those schools where high number of students are failing. So I think you can understand the impulse behind it, but my fear that is just going to, I think, create a lot more damage than help us. Again, there are ways in which one can assess students without making them pass or fail. Right? Some people have argued that this is not going to be exam where you can fail students. But then if you're not going to fail students, then I don't see what purpose exam would serve. Right? Otherwise, we have the same system without the exam. So the introduction of this exam has to mean, ipso facto, that it's the highest exam. You pass or you fail. If you fail, you start in the same year, right? Repeat the year in a sense, right? Or you do some remedial courses in the summer and then go up to the next class. So I think my thinking is that this requires so deeper thinking of introducing these 3 more exams. I think I don't want to remind people, but I think it's also a fact of life, the number of suicides, depressions, right, we see in the young population in India, right? My fear is that we are going to push that even further down the age. In the class 10 and 12, which is where it has been so far, is going to happen at class 8 level. Right? And that's not really a good thing for any society or any young person in the country. And that requires some rethinking in terms of how we achieve that goal of keeping accountability of the system without putting this kind of heavy-handed sort of emphasis on exams. I think second, my sort of concern, which is probably maybe unique to us, the Swatantra Party legacy people in a way, that we do believe the education doesn't need to be only non-profit, only philanthropic, right? The argument that even people made even at that time, that the people who want to provide education for profit should be allowed to do so. I think we know from history, from global experience, that in countries where it is legal to run for-profit schools and colleges, vast majority of them, right, almost 95% of them are non-profit. Right? It's legal to open for-profit school or college in the US, in UK, and most countries in the Western world, right? But most of them are not really for-profit schools and colleges. All the big names we hear about, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, they're all non-profit institutions. Right? Even though Harvard has $50 billion endowment, but it's still non-profit. So I think it is. I think they fear that somehow opening up sector to the for-profit is going to make the sector very commercialized, and which is the message that you read in the NEP, right? And therefore, that is going to be bad for education and for the country. I think that fear is somewhat unfounded, at least looking at the global experience, right? Secondly, I think we know that we have gotten to a point, which is of course point of no return in my view, that almost half of the students today in India go to private schools. And that is not going to turn back. Right? That river is not going to flow back anymore. Right? That's a part of our system. Right? No matter how much we improve government schools, there's no demand for private schools. And many parents will keep preferring private schools despite the improvements that can be made in the government schools. And of course, in a democracy, we should not be forcing parents to choose one. Right? They should have the option of choosing what they think is the right thing for their children. So I think my sense is that to use a stronger word, the hypocrisy of non-profit, right, is not going to serve our cause well. Right? We know most private schools make profit. Only thing is that the honest ones don't take the money out of the school system. Most people find different around it, right? I'm sure you've heard of the cases of where the school board meeting, or the board of trustees meeting of the school happens in Bahamas at the right point in time in the year, right? And all board members get a trip to attend with the family at the board meeting that is going to be held, right? So there are many different ways, and there's just no way no inspector or government can control all the different ways in which you can take the profit out of the system, out of the schools, right? And it's not, and I think it's not worth pursuing either. It's just going to create a very different kind of world than what we want. So I think we have to recognize that yes, for-profit schools exist, and they are going to be here. And if you don't allow them legally to be for-profit, then I think what we are doing is attracting very bad people to the system, right? I don't know if there are any politicians on the group, but you know that in many states in India, many colleges are run by politicians, at least owned partly by politicians, right? You have to ask yourself, what's about politicians that they run these schools and colleges, right? We know the only thing about them is the access to the clearances, permits and licenses the schools and colleges need, right? And those are easy to manage for politicians than for anybody else, right? I think we have created a system where we're attracting not so right people, to sort of put it mildly, to the sector, right, whose interest is not in education, it is not primary in education, it is somewhere else, right? And but the system is such that only they can enter the system and thrive, right? I know lots of people, many of the Teach for India fellows would be great school leaders, right? If only they can access finance, they would run great schools, right? But they would not be able to access finance, right? So only those who are either independently wealthy, have the real estate business, which has what has become now the education business largely, right, would be able to run schools and colleges in India, and that's not the right thing either. So my sense is by opening up the sector to for-profit, and with all precautions we need to take, right? We can define those rules around the for-profit sector as we do in many other areas. But within those framework of regulation, this will allow schools and colleges to run for profit. Right? Last point before I close, I know is we had 3-year degree for colleges, right? All of us have gone through 3-year college, well, except for medicine and engineering, which has been 4 and 5 years. Now we are moving towards 4-year degree. The basic degree would be 4 years over a period of time. Right? My sense is that no, like as they say, a broken clock gets right twice a day. Right? So in some sense, even though we may have seen our system to be broken, well, the world was 4-year degree and we were 3-year degree system. I think now maybe there needs to be less emphasis on formal training. Right? There's a lot more that's done on the job in real life, right? learn a lot more outside than within the education institution, right? And that I was thinking that what was seen as a mistake earlier was turning out to be just turning around the corner, in a sense, becoming the right thing to do. That less years in formal schooling, in this case, formal college, right? And open up more time to learn outside the formal structures, right? And I would have hoped that maybe fourth year could be a gap year that allows people to do anything they want to do, right? And that could be even before the third year, right? So I think my thought was the 3-year thing was becoming right, given how the knowledge acquisition and learning is taking place outside the formal structures, right? Now we are sort of introduced one more year in the degree, and maybe it's worth thinking about whether that's really necessary to require people to have spent one more year formally in colleges, and can that be done somewhat differently? So I think great transformative ideas in the NEP. I'm certainly very supportive of those ideas. You can say that partly because, of course, we advocated for many of those ideas in our own research work for a long time. But I think that's really the right path for us to build the system of education for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Parthji. I think it has been extremely fascinating. And you have brought in, from your vast experience and expertise, for years working in the field of education, your years of working in the West and then in India. I think you have really brought in very interesting dimensions and look at NEP. And it's very interesting how in our series on the NEP, we are getting to understand various intricacies of this vision, this document. And what you said at the end was, and that's why that was also a prime reason, since we have worked together in the past, and I knew the kind of inputs that you have also come forward given based on your experience for the formation of the NEP. And that's why I wanted people to come together. Many seniors are here. And yes, in fact, Mahesh Poddar, Member of Parliament, is also here from Rajya Sabha. He's a very dear friend. He's also here. So I wanted everyone to really get together and understand from your experience how this is. Now, before I request Shri Shakti Sinha to give his special remarks, we are all waiting to listen to him. A number of points, and I'm happy that this is being live streamed and this has been recorded. And your address today becomes a repository of understanding the perspectives on the NEP, and as well as some of the challenges and some of the things that need to have a deeper look at and discussion. On a personal note, what I liked was, because, like my PhD is on education. It is Shyama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation. So education forms a very key part of my life and work. And it's very interesting when you use the term non-profit NGO school. And in fact, I am a product of a non-profit NGO school, having studied in the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education. And I tend to agree with you on a personal level that regarding examination, because I grew up in a system where there were no examinations of the conventional kind. And yet, having gone through that system right from kindergarten till college, I also sat for competitive exams. I sat for, Dr. Raya is here, I sat for Central University exams, also examination, and I passed through. I was not, but examinations did not form, of course, but our stand of education was the Tagorian stand, was the Aurobindo stand. But this non-profit NGO schools, in that sense, Tagore, Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo, all of them form non-profit NGO schools. So I think, and especially when you speak about, how this strengthens the NIOS, a very important dimension you have brought out, which, many of the other speakers, when they spoke, this was not a focus that they made. They spoke on other things, but this is extremely NIOS. Then you speak about democratization and diversification of education. I think these are very interesting points that you have brought in. Some of these points are extremely close to my heart and experience. And after Shri Shakti Sinha has spoken, I have a question which I would come back to later on. But thank you so much, Dr. Shah. And I would request now Shri Shakti Sinha to really to come in with his special remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anirban, Dr. Ganguly, Dr. Shah. After you can hear me, right? Because I can't hear myself. Okay. Parth says yes, so actually you can hear me. Good. After Parth has spoken and very methodically and very carefully constructed this thing, I'll just add a few things, not too much. One, of course, that we've talked a lot about this bigger consultative process, which it was. It took a long time. If you see the first draft which came out and caused so much of controversy, and now tremendous amount of distillation has taken place. And I would feel it is not just a bottom-up approach, which is important. It also reflects partly messages going from the top to bottom. And as somebody who's been in the field of governance for close to 4 decades, I think that's a good thing. People don't realize the importance of clear messaging, a vision, a clear idea of directions. Where do I want to be? Sheer bottoms up feels very good, but if it's unguided, then you're not going to get a coherent piece of document. And this document reflects, to my mind, a great amount of coherence. So I think that is something which we should be very proud of. We can learn from it, and there are obviously things in it which can be changed. They have to be not just the word changed, has to be fleshed out better, because this is a policy document. It's neither a legal document nor is it an implementation plan. You have to work out different implementation plans for different parts of the policy, and therefore in that process, many of the points being raised can be fleshed out and made better, which I'm sure it will happen. For those who are not speaking, can I again request you to switch off, because I get disturbed by sounds coming, children's sounds and etc.
Venkatji, please switch off. Please mute.
Thank you, Anirban. Now, the next point which I want to really raise is that, and Parth mentioned it in the context of school, but I would think more in the context of higher education. For good service delivery of anything, there are 3 components to any service delivery: policymaker, implementer, and the regulator. And ideally, you should keep these 3 functions separate. Those parts of the economy which he mentioned also have done well, are where we have tried and separated these things. Why? It seems so simple, so why do you need to do it? Because one, and I'll start with the other end of the bargain, governments run schools, and I have been part of that, running schools. If I am running schools, whatever happens, I will defend myself. I will not critically look at my own performance. So in other words, there's a clear conflict of interest between a regulator and the person who does service delivery, which makes it worse when that person is also the policy maker. So my policy making is being distorted by the vision I get as an implementer. And therefore, I don't hold the same standards to my school that I'll hold to a private school, as an example, or a college maybe. And therefore, it's clear when you have the Higher Education Commission and you have 4 different verticals in it: regulation, pure policy making, separated; accreditation, separate; the funding, separate; and the academic standard setting, separate. So not only can you professionalize each of those, but you will also be able to ensure that there's no conflict of interest, that each of them is not colored by what the other is doing, because they're not, technically there's one Higher Education Commission, but in my vertical, I don't carry the baggage of either running a school or being worried about it, etc. So I think that is a very key thing, which we need to, so we're talking about improving our standards, we're talking of enforcing it and trying to see that every institution is able to maintain it. I think this will be a very, very good part of it, which I think we should be very grateful to it. But what I really like about the policy, and I'll basically talk about that only, is the concept. When you say democratization, what does it mean? One is access, fine. But if you look at the numbers of people who join, and this is a number floating around, primary school, to middle school, to secondary school, to a higher education, and if you look at the year of higher education, it's a good number. We are far ahead of, I thought, our times. But the number of people who do not complete their degrees, shockingly high. And therefore, and this is where I disagree with Parth, I think 4 years is a good idea, but that's not so important at this moment. The fact that, one, all of us need certain amount of multidisciplinary education. Pure verticals do not work anymore. I mean, I'm a terrible engineer if I don't understand how society functions. So I will look at engineering solutions and I will ignore the social and political problems that may arise in the course of my implementation. And therefore, to expose everybody to different fields. I met doctors in the US whose bachelor's degree is in literature. Nothing wrong with it. After doing the bachelor's in literature, the person goes on to do a rigorous medical course. It's tremendously important that the initial wide education helps that person. Here, to emphasize on multidisciplinary makes a lot of sense. And I'll come to the institution part later, but let's first talk about the student herself. The student has the option, delay. My circumstances are not the same as the circumstances of, say, Anirban. He can complete the course in 4 years or 3 years. I cannot. Either my capabilities are different, my home environment is different, I have economic issues I have to face. But if I drop out, can I go back? The answer is no. Here, not only can you come back, but your records are maintained, so I can come back anywhere in the system. If I start in Tamil Nadu, I can end up in Jammu. Nothing wrong with it. Today, migration is seen as a big issue, and universities can't cope with migration. Here, if my credits are stored somewhere, and I can always use it to advance my education somewhere else, it allows me tremendous amount of flexibility. And with the use of technology, not just through MOOCs, but through availability of learning material, digital learning material, I may be living in a small town in Bihar, but I'm able to access the best of lectures from anywhere. So it's not that because my father didn't have a good job enough in Delhi for me to be studying in a good university or college in Delhi or JNU or wherever, I'm not deprived of that. So with the combination of flexibility in terms of course content, flexibility in terms of time, and flexibility in terms of the institution where I go through my educational journey, if I allow all this to happen, which is what the NEP is saying, I think we are in for good times. I think we are in for very, very good times. On father's case, I'll give you, he did his MA economics in the late 40s, started his law, then joined the IPS. 20 years later, he wanted to continue. Fortunately, it was possible. He continued. He completed his law in his early 50s. After retirement, was practicing. I mean, the system should allow this to anybody to happen. So that, one, the way technologies are changing, the way we perform is changing, continuous learning is no more a luxury. It shall become, literally, there is no alternative to it. Most of the jobs I'm looking at in the year 2025 or 2030 definitely don't exist today. The education is not available today. I should provide for it, and I should have the ability to go back to higher education at any stage and keep upgrading myself in that sense. So that is something which I'm very. The second aspect of it is on why are Indian universities not figuring in the global ranking? Why are we so upset about it? Why? Because global universities are multidisciplinary universities. Harvard has an outstanding medical school, absolutely outstanding medical school. MIT, among the top 2-3 engineering schools in the world, has an economics faculty which generates Nobel Prize winners regularly. The point I'm trying to make is, if a university, and Delhi University had an engineering college which got separated, it became DTU, it had a medical school which got separated. You need universities to have wide variety, and within that, if you allow certain amount of movement laterally for people to do courses from here and there, you are not only going to provide much better education to the students that are coming to you, but your university's ability to be seen as a knowledge leader and its ability to generate knowledge gets tremendously exposed. We are stuck in the well and we talk to each other. That is simply not good enough for the 21st century. We have to change this attitude very, very strongly. School education, I'll just stop, and I said I won't speak too much because Parth has given us an outstanding explanation, is the fact that the need for pedagogical change is accepted, is brought up front. And it's just not in words. The more you allow for experiential learning through experience at a younger age, the better is your ability to start doing self-learning and to do research at a later stage. And in the school education part, the clear emphasis now is learning by doing is so much more important than just the old Suzuki method of monkey see, monkey do. I think that itself will be an excellent help to students as they move up. And therefore, when they go to school, college and become undergraduates, the ability to do research by themselves and with help, of course, of the teachers and their peers and mentors is very useful, would be really strengthened. So this link from age of 3 and 4 to the age of 2022, to see that development process through, you need this approach of moving in the direction of encouraging the children to be able to perform better. But for that, and there the implementation is the key issue, assessments are very important. At every stage, the child should be assessed. I'm not about examinations, but we have thought of it. We have thought of this continuous evaluation. We haven't been able to deliver on that. Much more than exams. Exams are important, but exams are a snapshot. Exams are not everything. But the ability at every stage, and if you go to Singapore, they'll tell you, there's a very harsh system, we can't. They actually start screening out people from academics into vocational at the age of 7 or 8, literally. We shouldn't do that. But from the age of, and the new NEP provides for it, bringing in a vocational education much earlier, not at +2 level, but much earlier. So that, again, you should be able to, the student, she must be able to explore what are my strengths. If I'm good with my hands, if I'm good with this, lateral, then you look at different fields. But we are all forced to follow rigid silos, and then we're left by ourselves. That is the mistake. So we have to completely change this approach. The NEP has suggested it. It's how we work out the implementation plan that will really deliver. And I'll end with just a couple of points. I think the for-profit is a very good idea. The vast majority of private institutions, on paper maybe not for profit, effectively they are for profit. And I remember seeing in Delhi schools 30 years ago, I'm sure it persists, because of demand-supply mismatch, more teachers available than private school jobs. Private schools are forced to pay government salaries, so they have to give a check of the X amount of salary because they said you can't pay by cash, pay by check. We were very smart, we'll catch these management fellows. Pay by check to the teachers. So teachers got paid by check and they had to give back cash to the management. So in effect, these institutions were functioning as for profit. Terrible thing to do in this backhand manner, but if we accept it as a reality of life, and few people will get it, no doubt, some will misuse, but a lot are misusing today. We're not stopping that, right? So if we accept that and allow for it, chances of misuse are actually much less. But if you try to police the wind, if you try to police the waves, you're going to fail. So might as well accept a bit of reality, lay down much more realistic guidelines, much more realistic regulations, and move ahead. And yes, there is one book I would recommend to anybody looking at how schools can deliver better outcomes. This is a book written by a guy called, I think, James Tooley, called A Beautiful Tree, where it talks about how these smaller schools with class 8 pass teachers are actually delivering much better educational outcomes than these 300 square foot classrooms with MA, BEd teachers, So the point is not to bring us down, but to see the situation and take best advantage of it, and not to straitjack everybody into following fixed norm. Education is all about freedom. And I'm shocked that the people who talk about freedom are the guys who are attacking this NEP for proposing freedom for academic institutions. And academic institutions need the freedom, they need guidelines, they have to be accountable. But if you don't give them freedom, they will not deliver. With that, let me end my remarks. Thank you very much, Anirban, for the opportunity. Over to you.
Thank you so much. As always, extremely thought-provoking, succinct, and direct. And exactly. Yeah, I think Parth is exactly making that. I was about to say, and he's put in that remark. You spoke about James Tooley's Beautiful Tree. Parth mentioned also Dharampalji's Beautiful Tree. And I think very interesting. I think we should also have another discussion on that because at this point of time, and I was just before this program, I was in a session on Dharampalji's writings discussing. It would be very interesting to read these two books at this point of time when we are discussing NEP. Our traditional systems of education, and that's where some of the terms like Shakti ji mentioned the Singapore model of vocationalizing and separating that. So, and Parth spoke about strengthening the alternate mode of education, and then the non-profit schools, plus the other also, that hypocrisy of non-profit, that point also. So we realize that especially Dharampalji brings in, I think very interestingly, all these aspects and shows how, and we have had this discussion, Parth and myself also in the past, how Indian system, the Indian organic, the civilizational system of education was very different from what it became later on. And that's what Gandhiji emphasized, and that's exactly what Dharampal also revived in a sense. I think very, very interesting points have come up in this discussion, and I'm really very grateful to Shakti ji also to bring in this these aspects. And now I have this one question, and then we'll just take maybe one or two questions that have come up here. My question is, I would like Parthji to tell us a little more about this early childhood education that you have seen in the NEP, and just a little more. I mean, you spoke about some of the terms that I liked that you said was obviously the regulatory architecture, then the science of learning, the focus on the science of learning. And I see this is what our epochal educational thinkers who grew out of the organic experience or experiment of education that took place in the last one century. Very interesting. And they all also spoke about focusing on the need to focus on the science of learning. And also learning outcomes accountability. These are all very interesting points that you have brought up from the NEP. Now, I am interested a little in if you could speak for a few more minutes on the early childhood education that you see as reflected in the NEP. One. Then there are two things I want to take from here. One is Kishore Asthana has asked, why do we have an antipathy towards examinations? I don't think you've spoken about an antipathy towards examination, but I think examination should have its place. It should, जिसको कहते हैं ना, जगह दिखाना है उनको बस. It should not dominate all our waking educational consciousness and our sleeping educational consciousness as well. So maybe you could, and then Professor Lipi Ghosh, Calcutta University, she's asked that one is a little detailed, but I don't know whether you would like to take that, but then it goes into a separate, because we'll have just a few more minutes. One is that how to connect this informal education, mannerism and values at home with formal education at school. If home training is adverse, education at school cannot be successful. Then she asked is, please tell us how NEP thinks about education for physically challenged persons. These two. I would like Parthji and Shaktiji also to come in whenever you have any. Yeah.
Let me take the second question about the homeschooling and the formal education, largely because my son goes to a Waldorf school, right?
Oh.
Yes, and that has been a big point of discussion among the parents. The school is only up to grade 5, so we are all worried about what would happen after grade 5, right? I think that's a very pertinent question, and I think is a question that requires somewhat more deeper thinking. So it's one thing to open up the system for different models of education, like Montessori, Waldorf, Aurobindo, right? There are many such, Rishi Valley,
Krishnamurti, yes.
We have in the country, right? And there are many not so well known. So I have come across many such schools in Pune and other parts of country, small schools, but a very different way of different philosophy of education, right? There are schools which are called democratic schools, and where there are no teachers. There are adults in the school, but there are no teachers. There is no instruction in the school, right? There are no exams and there are no textbooks. There are no textbooks either, right? And they do pretty well actually without those things also. Right? So there's a whole range of schools that we have. And one way I sort of define them on a one spectrum is how much of the school is controlled by adults, right? So the adult control education, if you want to put it that way, one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum would be student control education. How much of the system is controlled and decided by the students themselves. The democratic schools are at the other at this extreme, where not just the what is taught and what's learned, but also how the rules of the game, in a sense, all of those are designed by students. The students run their own sort of judicial system to then judge whether you violated any of the rules and then give you penalty for it, right? All of that is done by the students, and these schools are also very fabulous schools. So I think there's a whole spectrum of them. So I think NEP does open up the space for each one of these schools to try and see what works for the group of students that you have in your school. Right? Also a great opportunity for parents to choose what the right kind of education for their children. Right? At the same time, I think that is raised, and the question that we are all parents dealing with right now is that how do we then assimilate this into the sort of so-called mainstream? And that requires, I think, deeper thinking about the NIOS, how that is really structured, the assessments, how would they be done? How do you assessment could be done in a way that brings alignment between the sort of mainstream schooling with this alternative schooling which is going to go on, right? That's not an easy answer. I looked at very closely at Germany because Waldorf education started in Germany. That's the German educationist who started it. And they also have the same challenges, right? And they have not yet figured out a very good sort of way of making the transitions. Of course, given the long history of this education in Germany, they have schools which go up to class, kindergarten to class 12. You can do whole K to 12 within Waldorf system. Similar to, I think, what Dr. Ganguly has done in the Aurobindo school, right? You can start from kindergarten and go all the way to college. So unless you have that kind of integrated education, you can't really then how do you sort of go from one to the other? And that's an, I think, important question. I don't think I certainly have an answer to it, but I think it certainly requires thinking on our part of how that can be made possible. Of course, somebody comes up with a solution, it will solve my problem. I will not have to worry about figuring out how to where to go after class 5. On early childhood, I think all of us know in terms of the capacity of the brain and development of the brain in the young, right? And what it needs in terms of nutrition, in terms of stimulation, engagement, right? I think system challenge we have is the Anganwadi system on one hand that has been built for this purpose, right? It's run from a different ministry, not run by the education ministry, right? And how do we make it more focused, not so much on nutrition and care of the mother and the child, which is what Anganwadis are largely focused on. How do we bring sort of academic content, to put it that way, into that structure? And are the Anganwadi workers going to be able to accommodate that kind of a new kind of work that they would have to perform within the system? What kind of training they would require, right? So there are issues of those kinds in making this idea, how do we implement that idea, right? I think idea is almost, there is no dispute around the idea, right? That we need to focus on early childhood education.
Shakti ji, thank you. Shakti ji, yes.
Yeah. Just to add a few things, there's enough evidence now globally that up to the age of, say, 9, 10, 80% of your learning outcomes comes from your home environment, which is why people complain about, oh, the children are laggard. Don't blame the children for it. They're coming to their first generation literates. They don't have their environment at home. Look at behind me, number of books. This is a small collection. So, we come from a background where we are used to reading and writing. Our mothers and our fathers can help us and promote us and push us. And the fact that children at the age of 3, 4, 5 are able, as an example, in families with multilingualism or where your mother tongue is one and you're living in a different region, and children at a very young age are speaking mother tongue at home and the regional language outside home very comfortably, very easily. So it really underestimates the ability of younger children to pick up So they have tremendous abilities, and therefore, in Anganwadis, and if you start the proper process of education, proper process of making them go through, walk them through. So not teach them in that sense, I agree. In fact, on the light, I'll just divert for a second. At the education in Delhi, where I used to go to our government schools, I had to walk around, and where in the primary classes I heard Shor Sharaba, I knew it was a good school. If I heard that in the senior classes, I knew it was a bad school, and vice versa. If the primary classes are quiet, that school is not a good school at all. Encourage the children to grow. But to come back, so therefore, I would feel that the need to start it early is required. In any case, people again of economically better, richer backgrounds are teaching their kids at home and play schools at a very young age. Recognize that reality. And therefore, I think by bringing it in, it's a very good step. Now, it's not very easy. There are problems, no doubt. So again, I said implementation is the key. The other thing, I think the point raised by somebody was about children with for physically challenged, etc. Now, initially, our approach to that was had different schools for them. Then it came, no, let's integrate them. So it's called integrated education. So they'll study in the regular schools, but with special teachers. They're called special teachers. Anyway, now NEP talks about that in regular teacher education, knowledge of how to teach children with specific disabilities will be there. So it's not just a special teacher knowing how to do that, but teacher of geography and chemistry and Hindi being able to do that. So that is very, very important. You would definitely require to use devices, technologies. So that is a key component of it. It is there in the document. Again, I said the devil is in the detail in the implementation. How do we do it? That's important. The National Institute of Open School has a very great role to play in really developing proper methodologies for teaching the Indian Sign Language. That people who are hearing challenge can really participate as productive members of society. So I think NEP in different ways has tried to address all of that. It is a small document compared to a policy document. It is a small document, which is a good thing. It allows you the flexibility as you develop your implementation plan or make the legal challenges to make it very contextual. So therefore, I'm a little more hopeful than am I 40 years of most government policies, because we have a tendency to make grand statements. We leave it at that. Here, it does allow you the actual flexibility to build in the specifics. And I hope that this happens. The jury is out there. The jury is out there. The intentions are good. If you have people like Manjul, Bhargav involved in it, I'm sure it will be a good policy, But how do we implement it? That is the key thing. I'm hopeful, but let's keep our fingers crossed.
Thank you so much. As you know, we will be now winding up, concluding. But I'm tempted to take two questions here for myself. I think, this question, why don't there be a single education system all over the country? I think it is essential first to read this 60-page document. And then when the 400-page document comes out of the NEP, please read it. And then perhaps we can again get back to discussing the next portions and all that. Because Prime Minister himself has very clearly said, and right at the beginning, that what he says that this is a document which has no bias in it, which has been made. There were 170,000 suggestions which came in while preparing the document, and right from Panchayat to members of parliament, in between educationists and people were consulted. And he says that the work is now, the next step, as Shakti ji has said, a new round of dialogue and coordination with universities, colleges, school education boards, different states, different stakeholders is about to start from here. And the purpose of this exercise is this. This is the 5th in the series that we have done. And it's very interesting that we have personalities of the stature of Dr. Parth, Shah and Shakti Sinha here discussing this at this level. And right yesterday we had 100 educationists, people involved with education at the grassroots level in West Bengal also discussing this. So it's a very interesting exercise that we have undertaken. So first is essential to read the document. Second is, Nishit has asked this question, how is the NEP addressing the issue of purpose of education especially for the students passing out of grade 12, etc., etc. The point is that, you see, in the first, on 7th August, quoting Tagore, Prime Minister said this: the highest education is that which does not merely give information, but makes our life in harmony with all existence. I think, and I'll club it with this question: why can't we create a country education policy based on the teachings of Tagore, Shri Aurobindo, Ambedkar, and Radhakrishnan? I would like to say, because since my area of specialization has been the national education movement, having done that and having looked at this document, the fundamental underlying essential driving philosophy of this document synergizes all those names. And that is why Venkat ji, please aap silent kar dijiye. And that is why it's very interesting that all these aspects, you talk about Gandhiji's basic education, you speak about Sri Aurobindo's integral education, you speak about Tagore's global citizen yet connected to the roots. All this is there in this. And I must say that Free India, in the early days, Free India was the first, Free India's education system was the first one to reject Gandhiji's basic education and Nayi Talim, which would give dignity to, like Prime Minister has asked this question: how is it that the idea of high and low and mocking stance towards people who engage in the labor has crept into our minds? Indian education has never this differentiation. That's why you have the concept of bagless education which is coming. So therefore, Nishit, your question is answered in this document, in the spirit of this document itself. Because it's a fundamental question that Prime Minister himself asks. He says, what kind of education is that which doesn't develop critical thinking and innovative thinking? At the same time, if there is no passion for education, if an education doesn't have a philosophy and purpose, what education is that? And therefore today, after so many years, you see, we are listening to someone like, Parth Shah is saying, if he is saying it, then it has the stamp of endorsement. He is saying that this NEP strengthens alternate modes of education. India is a country which was built on, its education consciousness was built on alternate modes. And then, as I keep arguing, that when we formed our education system policy post-independence, we did not derive from those education institutions which were part of our quest for freedom. The Gujarat Vidyapeeth, I would urge all of you to read the Vishwa Bharati debate of 1951, where Dr. Mukherjee is saying, please preserve Vishwa Bharati and Shanti Niketan as a unique experiment. Give it all support, but don't standardize it. Don't regulate it. We should have done that at that time. But his motion was defeated. And the government took over. Fine, the government took over. It had its pros, but it had a lot of opposites that happened to Vishwa Bharati. And best part of it is we spoke about Tagore, but we did not derive anything from Tagore. We paid homage to Gandhiji's vision of education, but we kept basic education aside. And let me say that I don't have a formal degree of graduation. My BA degree is equivalent to graduation. But I went on to do a PhD in education. I went on to do a master's. But then, there would have been 10 cases in a court saying that he has forged his document. He's not actually a literate in the official sense. So I think a lot of these is answered here, and I'm extremely happy that these points.
Can I add a sentence? Yes. Can I add a sentence? That's a sentence.
Yes. Yes, Vishnuji, you will also come in. Yes, Vishnuji, you will also come in. Yes.
After Shakti,
yes.
Okay. I want to make a brief comment.
Absolutely.
My only sentence is, at the Active Education Delhi, a school like this with different type of education that Parth mentioned wanted recognition I overruled my department. They had eight people in a class, etc. I
Yes.
overruled it and gave them recognition. Unfortunately, now after 30 years, that school has become a standard school like any other school.
Other.
It has given up its experimental character completely. It has become a rote of the mill CBSE school. So
Yes.
I get your point of Vishwa Bharati and Shanti Niketan completely. That's all.
Right. Yes, exactly, Shakti ji. That is what. Thank you. So I'll just Vishnu ji wants to make a point, and then we can.
Well, thank you very much, Anirbanji. Am I audible?
Yes.
Well, I would like to congratulate you, first of all, and both the speakers for an excellent session today. For someone who is not so much involved in this field of education, it has been great learning. Amongst other things, the two comments that I would like to take further. One is what was written about strength of the NIOS. And secondly, what Shakti mentioned about implementation. So I think, implementation is the key to what we are trying to do. Quality and systems need to be also looked at. Now, I have had fortuitously experience I want to share with NIOS. My cook wanted to study again, and I decided not to go through doubts, but directly work with NIOS. Believe me, it has been a great eye opener. Their phones are incorrect. So I tried 1 hour to contact them. 1 hour, I thought that instead of calling Shakti or a friend and saying, "मुझे अंकल का कोई number बता दो ताकि मैं कर लूं," I thought I'll go the normal way. Spent 1 hour, called everybody from Kerala to Chandigarh to Bhubaneswar trying to get a number, and it was not. So the systems have been made so difficult that it is basically the touts who are ruling the roost. They tell me that साहब हम 5,000 रुपए और लेंगे और करवा देंगे. Now, if this is how what I have had to face, how will distance learning be performed? Because literacy mission, NIOS has a great role to play. I wanted to bring this to the attention of this August forum that this strengthening needs to be done. Thank you.
So what we'll do is we will next we'll invite the chairman of NIOS to speak on the NEP, and you can then directly ask